Thank you, everyone, for taking your seats. I know it's a challenging time, so I think we'll just go ahead and get started, and we'll just know that some folks will be joining us as we begin. Before we begin our program, I'd like to share several brief administrative notes. We will be hosting a Q&A at the conclusion of the lecture at about 6 o'clock, and we invite you to submit your questions. If you're here with us in the Fitz Auditorium, please use the note cards provided for you and pass those to the end of your row. And those of you joining us virtually, please use the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen. Please do so by 5:45 so we can collate those questions. Thank you. We ask as a courtesy to our speaker that you please silence your cell phones. And for attorneys joining us this evening seeking CLE credit, please be prepared to take note of 3 CLE passcodes that I will read throughout the event, the first one very shortly. You will submit these electronically along with your evaluation, which will be emailed to you. I will read the first code now. The first code is opioid. I repeat, the first code is opioid. I'm Catherine Restrepo, and as the Executive Director of the Master-in-Law Program, the sponsor of this evening's event, we welcome you as we gather to celebrate one amazing human being, Dr. Ronald S. Littman. I had the pleasure of working with Ron in the earliest days of this program. Ron was so generous with his time despite having huge responsibilities elsewhere. He was quick to volunteer to help us build the legal content he felt was vital for physicians and healthcare leaders to know in order to be the most effective advocates for their patients and change agents for needed improvements to our healthcare system, most especially in the area of patient safety. He was warm and insightful, with a quick wit and easygoing attitude that belied the passion for the things about which he cared deeply. Legal education for those in positions to make a difference was one such thing. He saw the awesome power of the law and all that it enabled for those who understood it, especially those who indeed could use their positions of influence to effect great change. Ron didn't do this for his own gain, but rather for others, so that they might acquire the powerful and necessary tools to achieve societal impact. Of course, Ron was so many wonderful things, but what impressed me most was his humility and the joy and gratitude with which he lived every single moment. He never missed a chance to say thank you, and most especially to express how grateful he was that the law school offered such a program and that he was given the opportunity to participate, learning in our law school classroom, engaging with great thinkers from the law and across many disciplines. He'd often stop by the Master-in-Law suite saying it was the best thing ever and the most fun he's ever had. I extend a very warm welcome and great thanks to Ron's parents, Arthur and Barbara Litman, for joining us tonight, for bringing Ron into this world. He was a gift to us all, and for clearly doing everything right as parents, as evidenced by Ron's good, kind, and generous nature. I must express my deepest gratitude to Daphna, Ron's wife, who, despite her unfathomable grief after Ron's passing, devoted herself to helping make this evening's event a memorial fitting of someone of Ron's stature and accomplishments, someone who meant so much to so many. It was Daphna's sage advice that Ron would have appreciated an event brief on memorial remarks about him and instead focusing on something of import and interest to many, something that needed attention, something that needed to be fixed. Daphna also suggested focusing on this book, The Empire of Pain, the author of which is our featured speaker this evening, describing it as among Ron's favorite books, as much for its beautifully written prose as for its accurate and clear portrayal of the complex origins of and where responsibility rests for the opioid crisis. To so many here at Penn Carey Law who helped plan this evening's event and reception, the amazing Master-in-Law team, the conferences and events team, especially Neoshi, ITS, Professor Allison Hoffman, and of course, Dean Ruger. This was a school-wide effort, indeed, a labor of love by a community who so loved Ron. Thank you all. Finally, to the extended Litman and Klausner family, Ron's friends and colleagues from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia who join us in great numbers tonight, we thank all of you for supporting us as we host this event in Ron's honor. It means so much to us to be able to do this for you, to show you how much Ron has meant to us. We hope the celebration of Ron's life will alleviate your pain, if only for a moment. We want you to know that we share in your sadness as much as we celebrate all of our great fortunes in ever having known this wonderful man. All of our lives are enriched because of Ron, and he will forever be a part of our community as we continue to do our best work with him in mind. And now I'm honored to take this opportunity to play for you a message from our interim university president, Dr. Wendell Pritchett.
I'm so pleased to have this opportunity to say a few words about Ron Littman this evening. Although in my current capacity I serve as interim president of Penn, I'm very excited to be returning full-time to teaching next year as a member of the standing faculty of the Penn Carey Law School. Just as there are great teachers who illuminate the classroom with their passion and erudition, there are great students as well. They are the ones who are excited to learn, eager to engage, and fearless in asking questions and challenging received orthodoxy. They understand that in order to truly learn, you have to stretch your mind, stretch your imagination, stretch the boundaries of what you know to be true. At Penn Carey Law, Ron Littman was an exemplary student, a favorite among faculty and fellow students alike. His enthusiasm sparked many great discussions both inside the classroom and out of it. His energy and excitement moved us all to be our very best and helped shape the contours of the Master in Law program that sponsors this annual lecture. Over the years, I enjoyed many conversations with Ron, usually at our shared happy place, the Germantown Cricket Club. We talked about lots of things, but more than anything, we talked about family and his fascination with the law. The qualities of passion, commitment, and intellectual curiosity define Ron's outstanding achievements in his day job as a renowned teacher, writer, and practitioner of pediatric anesthesia. He cared for countless patients. He mentored innumerable young physicians in training. He was a role model to so many. It's very hard when someone as gifted and talented and caring and kind as Ron is taken from his family and friends far too early. We all share in his loss. But we are grateful too for the wonderful time that Ron was among us. We remember all that he gave and all his many interests, including his great concern and advocacy for the safe use and prescribing of medicines. This lecture tonight by noted author Patrick Radden Keefe touches directly on an issue of great import to Ron. So on behalf of the entire Penn community, I welcome him and I welcome you all to this lecture this evening. Thank you.
Yes, Ted, I invite you to the podium.
Thank you. I'm Ted Ruger, the Dean of University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. I think more importantly, in this context, I had the privilege of being a professor, a teacher of and a student of Dr. Ron Littman twice in official classes and many other occasions where I learned from him over a decade or more from when he first appeared in my health law class in 2009. I'll return to his influence on this law school. I'll be brief because I'm speaking in between the university president and our distinguished guest, whom I'll introduce in a minute, but I want to make 4 points. The first is this is a special version of an annual tradition, and as such we honor not just a remarkable graduate, but the program which he was a part of, which he did a part of building, and which is our fastest growing, in many ways one of our most successful programs, and this is the Master in Law program at the Penn Law School. It's founded on the proposition that that really I think all law schools, including this one, lost sight of during the past century, which is that law should not be just for lawyers. And so, you know, whereas I think this is something we didn't do as much of in the past, we, since 2014, have invited brilliant professionals and students ranging from undergraduates all the way up until to very senior professionals, both from across all of Penn's other schools, as well as increasingly nonprofits and businesses and universities up and down the East Coast. And it's this is our Master in Law program. It fits with our philosophy that law is deeply connected to other disciplines. About 70% of our JD graduates each year leave here with a degree or a certificate from some other part of this great university. And this is the other side of that coin, and it's our, you know, sort of in the past decade, the philosophy that we ought to do our best to share the insights of law and regulation with brilliant professionals and citizens and members of society from other fields, and we're the better for it. This year, we honor one of our very first graduates and one of our very first students in that program. Indeed, Dr. Ron Littman, I think, was brought so much intellectual energy and curiosity from his role at CHOP that he affected my thinking and our thinking about the inception of this Master in Law program itself. So he was there before the creation of the program. He was sort of our initial patient. He was the paradigmatic, I say patient, student, and just the way he brought not just his own love of learning and curiosity about the law that all of us who taught him saw and were inspired by, but the way every single class that he took from all of us was the better because of his insights. And so, we want to build on that, both, certainly honoring him tonight, but we build on it every day as we try to expand the number of students who come into this law school who may not want to be lawyers, but who are working in fields that intersect with the law and bring their own insights, and that's clearly sort of our philosophy going forward, and Ron was very important in inspiring us there. So we honor him, and I'm so grateful, as my colleagues have said, to have Daphne and Ron's family here, and so many friends and colleagues and family listening remotely as well. Third, I want to mention we will here on behalf of the law school, we're not going to stop honoring the memory of this incredible member of our community with this lecture. We've dedicated funds so that for the years going forward, every year we're going to award a scholarship for an ML student. It'll be the Dr. Ronald Littman Scholarship, which in a sense will, we hope, bring every year, or we know, bring students that bring something of what Ron did. So it'll be students and applicants who demonstrate a commitment to focusing on the critical issues of the day, working across fields, healthcare, legal regulation, patient safety, demonstrating a lifelong love of learning in the great tradition of Dr. Litman. And we will prioritize applicants from his home institution, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and look forward to sort of building on the bridges he built and partnering further with CHOP and future professionals there. And so we want that to be a durable commitment that builds on really the inspiration that Ron gave us all. Finally, as all of us who knew Ron knew, he was interested in the most important issues of the day. One of them was the issue of addiction and opioid use, and the deep connections between industry and regulation and the healthcare fields and the legal fields. We know that Ron was very much admired and was interested and liked the book Empire of Pain that our featured speaker Patrick Radden Keefe so importantly wrote, and so it is my great pleasure, and I'll hand off to the keynote speaker in a moment, just to welcome and very briefly introduce Patrick Radden Keefe. He's an award-winning journalist and writer at the New Yorker magazine, recipient of the 2014 National Magazine Award for feature writing, and then again in 2015 and again in 2016. Apparently somebody else, you let somebody else have it in 2017. Mr. Keefe received a Guggenheim Fellowship and was originally from Boston, now resides in New York. Importantly, and I think we're all grateful that you'll share the insights from this really impactful, important, one of the most important nonfiction books written in recent years about the legal, corporate, medical history and sort of inside account of the rise of the, a major component of the opioid epidemic, entitled Empire of Pain, The Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you. Thank you, and we look forward to your insights.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming out this evening. Boy, listening to people talk about Ron, it's funny. You think about, a life well lived, and I didn't have the pleasure of knowing him, but even just in talking to people who did know him, that's the way to do it. I mean, we should all hope, I think, that when we're gone, people describe us in that kind of language. So it's an inspiration for me, and I feel humbled and honored to be able to speak with you all this evening in his name here. I think what I'll do is just tell you a little bit about the book and how I came to write it, and then try and draw out some issues that may be of particular interest to you. I know that this is an issue that Ron felt strongly about and had worked on well before he came across my book. I'm actually a lawyer by training. I never practiced, but I did go to law school with a couple of people who are here this evening. And my day job is I write for The New Yorker and write about different things. I don't really have a beat, but one subject that has always been very interesting to me, excuse me, is drugs. And particularly the way in which we categorize and think about and regulate different types of drugs. So I wrote a big piece for The New Yorker a number of years ago about the legalization of cannabis in Washington state, and the idea that you had an existing, decades-long, mature, robust black market in marijuana, and then with the stroke of a pen, it becomes a taxed and regulated legal industry, and what did that transformation look like? I've researched and written a great deal about the Mexican drug cartels, and I tended to think of them not just as murderous criminal enterprises, which they are, but also as businesses, as pretty sophisticated transnational commodities enterprises. And I wrote a big piece for the New York Times Magazine in 2012, which was a kind of a Harvard Business School case study of the Sinaloa cartel. This was long enough ago that when I pitched it to the magazine, I had to explain who this fellow Chapo Guzman was, who ran the cartel. He was not a household name at that point. But one of the things I was interested in when it came to the Sinaloa cartel was to what degree do they vertically integrate, how diversified are they, and they would export cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, and marijuana into the United States, and indeed various other countries around the world. And I came across this riddle, which was that in 2010, the Sinaloa cartel suddenly started sending more heroin into the US. And nobody could really account for this, for why it was that law enforcement was suddenly finding the streets of the United States flooded with Mexican heroin in a way that they hadn't been previously. And of course, because we tend, I think in this country, when we think about illegal drugs, to think about them purely in terms of the supply side and not the demand side, there was this notion of kind of, what are these capricious Mexican drug lords doing now, sending all this heroin here, when of course, really this was driven by demand. And what I discovered as I looked into this was that there was a generation of new heroin consumers in the United States who previously had not been the kinds of people who would necessarily go out and buy heroin on the street or shoot a drug into their arm using a needle. And they had had an on-ramp to heroin, which was FDA-regulated opioid pharmaceuticals. So when I say opioids, I mean a drug that derives from the heroin poppy. And in this case, it would have been painkillers, opioid painkillers, which have been approved by the FDA and sold by Big Pharma, which many, many people had come to take, grow addicted to or dependent on, abuse in some cases. And people were dying. And finding that eventually it became easy, once they were addicted, to transition from these licit pharmaceuticals that they had developed a problem with to their chemical cousins on the black market, heroin. Hence this sudden surge in Mexican heroin. So this seemed interesting to me, because again, it seemed to kind of straddle that line between illegal drugs and legal drugs and the ways in which we treat these drugs differently. You're all very familiar with not just the rhetoric that we employ when we talk about Mexican drug cartels and the illegal drug trade, but also the hammer of our criminal justice apparatus when it comes to going after people who are involved in that side of the business. And it seemed interesting to me that when it came to pharmaceutical executives, the treatment and the public perception was much different. So as I looked into this public health crisis that we now refer to as the opioid crisis, which is really a complex and evolving crisis that has gone on for over 25 years now and started with prescription pharmaceuticals, and I should say it's had several phases. Eventually it kind of morphed into a heroin crisis, and then more recently into a fentanyl crisis. But the origin of this crisis was FDA-approved drugs that were prescribed by physicians. And there are quite a few corporate bad actors in this story, but as I delved into it, I learned that there was one company that played a special role, which was this company, Purdue Pharma, a relatively small pharmaceutical company based in Stamford, Connecticut, which had introduced in 1996 a groundbreaking painkiller, OxyContin, which was a very powerful opioid painkiller that I think many people who have studied this, myself included, believe it was really this drug that was in the words of somebody who worked at Purdue Pharma, was the tip of the spear. It precipitated the opioid crisis. But what really got my attention was learning that Purdue Pharma was a privately held company owned entirely by the Sackler family. And this was striking to me because I knew that name. I grew up in Boston, and after high school I took a year off because I really wanted to go to Columbia, and I didn't get in the first time, so I had to take a year off and work for a year and apply again. And I worked as an usher at the American Repertory Theater in Harvard Square. And I would go to the Sackler Museum in Harvard Square. And I moved to New York City for college, and I would go to the Sackler Wing at the Met. And I moved to London, and the Sackler name is all over London. The British Museum, the Tate, the Serpentine, it's everywhere. And then eventually I moved to DC, where there's a Sackler Gallery, the Smithsonian, right there on the mall. And so I didn't know much about the Sacklers. I had a kind of ambient awareness of the name the way you would Carnegie or Rockefeller. And I sort of assumed it was probably some great fortune, very illustrious, generous family that had made its money back in the era of the robber barons. And it was a great surprise to me to learn that, in fact, most of this vast fortune had been made in recent decades from the sale of OxyContin. So this seemed interesting. And what was particularly interesting to me was that these two different stories had not really been connected. I was by no means the first person to come out and break the news that Purdue Pharma was a pretty bad actor in the opioid crisis, or that the Sackler family owned Purdue Pharma. But for whatever reason, those facts hadn't really connected to the family itself. The family had been very, very effective in kind of insulating themselves from that sort of scrutiny. I think in no small measure because their name was emblazoned on all of these elite cultural institutions, among them the University of Pennsylvania, where there was a Sackler lecture that was started by Richard Sackler and his wife, who was a graduate. So I started looking into the history of the family. And it turns out that if you really want to find the origins of this story, you have to go back before the introduction of OxyContin in 1996. It really starts with these three brothers, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond Sackler, who grew up in Brooklyn against the backdrop of the Great Depression. Their parents had come from Europe at the turn of the last century. The parents didn't speak English initially, spoke Yiddish at home, and didn't have much, but believed that in the United States, if they got good educations for their kids, that in the scope of a single lifetime, you could completely change the fortunes of a family, which they did. So they sent these three boys to public school in Brooklyn, and they told them, we want you to be doctors. That's what you're going to do. There was a sense of doctors as kind of stewards, as figures of great moral probity. There was stability. You could make money, but there was also a virtue there. And I think in the mythology of the family, a sense that physicians were incorruptible. So all three brothers become doctors. The oldest is Arthur, and he's this incredible figure. As a nonfiction writer, you know, a lot of what you're dealing with is kind of, it's found art. You go out and you dig and you look under rocks and you see what you can find, and occasionally you stumble on something pretty magical. And Arthur Sackler he's like a character who walked out of a Saul Bellow novel. He had this incredible kind of mid-century vigor. There was a sense from early on that he had to support his family during the Depression, and so he started getting jobs, and he became he worked on the high school newspaper, and then became the advertising manager at the high school newspaper, and started going into advertising and marketing even as a teenager. And he comes out and he works his way through medical school writing copy for a pharmaceutical company. So eventually Arthur and his two brothers all become doctors. They all become psychiatrists. but they also want to make money. And Arthur's specialty is marketing, going right back to the high school newspaper. So he ends up, he's a practicing physician, he's doing medical research, but in addition to all that, he joins and then takes over a kind of pioneering pharmaceutical advertising company in the 1940s. And he becomes kind of the Don Draper of medical advertising in the 1940s and 50s. He's incredibly creative. He has all kinds of ideas for how you would sell drugs, not just to patients, but also to physicians who are writing the prescriptions. And it's a hugely exciting time in the history of the pharmaceutical business. This is after the introduction of penicillin. It's in that post-war period when you have a lot of these companies that are the big pharma companies of today emerging, and they're starting to go into branded pharmaceuticals. They're rolling out new drugs each week, and they need to figure out a way, how do we get these to the attention of doctors? And Arthur Sackler has the answer. So I would say in retrospect, he's a little slippery in the way he does this. He realizes that you want to get sales reps to go out there, you want to be armed with really serious-looking medical literature, you want to wine and dine doctors. He realizes that the endorsement of one physician is often the best way to sell another physician. So in a fairly egregious example of this, one of his advertising spreads has the business cards of 8 doctors, I think it was, and it says, you know, clinically approved, and you see these different physicians from across the country. And there was a muckraking journalist, this is back in the 50s, who writes to each of the doctors wondering, well, what kind of clinical tests did you do on this drug? And his letters are returned to him. And so he calls the phone numbers on the business cards and discovers that the business cards are made up. The doctors didn't exist. But this is the kind of sleight of hand that Arthur engaged in. There's another part of this story, though, which is that as Arthur's fortunes grow, and I should say the drug that really made his fortune is Valium. First Librium and then Valium. He designed the marketing for these drugs, and Librium, which was also a minor tranquilizer, and then Valium became, each in their turn, the best-selling drug in the history of the pharmaceutical business at that time. And so Arthur becomes hugely rich marketing these drugs, which I'll say just parenthetically, can be habit-forming. But that was not something that people were warned about. He becomes very wealthy, and he starts giving money away. It starts pretty early on. I went into the archives at Columbia University, which is really the first place that the brothers start to donate money. And they're donating money, and always with a stipulation that the Sackler name must go on the gift. Arthur had a longtime lawyer who said, if you want your name on it, that's not charity. That's a business deal. And you see this pattern that plays out over the decades. They were often very crafty about it. There's a wonderful story about Arthur donating to the Met. This is at a period in the 1960s when the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York needed funds because, as you know, if you visited, you don't have to pay to get in. And so they were short on funds, and Arthur proposed this deal to them, which is, well, you have this gallery of these exquisite Asian masterpieces that you bought, you know, early in the 20th century. What if I just buy all of those from you and then donate them back to you? They never leave the gallery, but you have to put a little sign next to each one that says it's a gift of Arthur Sackler. And I'm going to buy them from you at the price that you paid in the early 20th century, and I'm going to write them off on my taxes at the current market value. And so there are these kind of amazing deals that he does along the way, but he becomes a big philanthropist, and so do his brothers. And as I was trying to figure out why it is that they would have done this, I realized that he had a certain discomfort with some of the conflicts of interest that he was engaged in increasingly, and I think there was a sort of a sense, not so much that he wanted to expiate his sins, but that he wanted to kind of distract a bit, just as the robber barons did before, from the sometimes sordid origin of his fortune. But there's another story that really struck with me, which is that during the Depression, their father, the 3 brothers, their father, Isaac Sackler, loses everything. And he summons his boys to him, and he says to them, I've lost everything. I'm not going to be able to pay for your education. The one thing that we wanted to give you, you're going to have to finance yourselves. But in a moment of pride, he kind of straightens up and says, but you know, I haven't given you nothing. In fact, I've given you the most important thing that a parent can give a child, a good name. And Isaac Sackler tells his children, you know, if you lose a fortune, you can always make another fortune. But if you lose your good name, you can never get it back. And it's not long after that that he dies, and this multi-decade project starts on the part of this family to build up the good name, to make the name Sackler mean something. In 1987, Arthur dies. And if you're keeping track, OxyContin isn't introduced until 1996. I think that Arthur's story is really important for what comes later, which is the reason that I tell it to you here and I do in my book at such length. But by the time Arthur dies in '87, there's a company that he had purchased decades earlier for his brothers, at the time called Purdue Frederick, which was sort of a moribund little pharmaceutical company, which for years made most of its money with kind of humdrum over-the-counter product. They had an earwax remover. They had you know, a disinfectant scrub. But they started getting into the treatment of pain in the 1970s and 1980s. And this happens at a time when there's a reconsideration in the medical profession of how we think about pain and how we treat pain. There was a generation of physicians who essentially said, listen, you know, we haven't taken pain seriously enough. We tend to think of it as just a symptom of other problems. We need to be thinking about treating it more aggressively. And associated with this was a conversation about opioids. So for thousands of years, we've known that the opium poppy has a series of really interesting characteristics. It has this incredible therapeutic power to relieve pain. But twinned with that, inextricably, is the fact that it can be very habit-forming and for some people extremely addictive. And so there's always been, I think, this ambiguity about the status of the opium poppy and drugs that are derived from it, where you have these two qualities. And Purdue Frederick in the 1980s introduces a morphine pill called MS-Contin, which is a sort of slow-release morphine pill. It has a seal around it that means that the drug slowly filters into your system. And it's a great success for the company, for Arthur Sackler's two younger brothers, Raymond and Mortimer, and for their families, who increasingly are joining the company and dominating the board. So MS-Contin is a success primarily for the treatment of cancer pain. And this makes sense because the medical establishment at that time tended to treat strong opioids as it's sort of a nuclear solution. It's the thing you keep on the top shelf that you reach for when lesser remedies have failed. You would see them often in end-of-life situations or in the treatment of things like cancer pain. So MS-Contin is a great success. But eventually the patent on MS-Contin is running out. One thing I found in looking into big pharma is that if you're ever confused about decisions that are made and you sort of can't find a logical explanation, generally it has to do with the patent life and fears about the patent life and concern about extending the patent life. An issue which I should say for the notion that law is not just for lawyers, really is as much a legal issue as it is a legal and commercial issue as much as it is a medical one, and one of many instances in this story in which I would argue that commerce hijacks medicine. But the patent's about to run out. There's a fear that generic companies are going to come in and the profits that they've been enjoying will disappear. And so the Sacklers and the senior executives at their company start talking about rolling out some new opioid. And they come up with the idea of, well, what if we took that seal, what they call Contin, the Contin seal that they had on MS-Contin, which slowly filters the drug into your system, and we put a different opioid in there? What if we used oxycodone? So oxycodone is a more powerful opioid than morphine is. But what they found when they did these focus groups was that it was less well known. They found that MS-Contin, because it was a morphine drug, had a stigma, that morphine has a stigma. What doctors told them was, when you tell somebody that their grandmother is going on morphine, to them that means your grandmother is going to die. And so there's a discomfort around morphine. But they found that with oxycodone, there was no such stigma. And in fact, to the degree that physicians, and here I'm not talking about anesthesiologists necessarily or people who are experienced in the treatment of pain, but general practitioners, if they knew about it, they knew about it from drugs like Percodan or Percocet, in which you have a quite small amount of oxycodone, which is cut with aspirin or acetaminophen. So there was a sense they found in these focus groups that doctors actually thought that oxycodone was a milder remedy than morphine. And there are these incredible emails that I got a hold of where you get these senior executives talking about this and saying, we have to be careful when we market this drug not to do anything to let doctors realize they have that wrong, because we could really benefit from this misapprehension that they have. And here they make this exquisite pivot, which is that in the end, there are only so many people who suffer from cancer. It's a limited market. And what they really wanted, the real prize, was what if you could market an opioid for the treatment not just of severe pain, but of moderate pain, back pain, sports injuries. That market would be tens of millions of people. And so that becomes the plan with OxyContin, is we're gonna create an opioid for the masses, basically. And there's one big challenge that they have, which is that there does still exist some reluctance on the part of physicians to prescribe these drugs willy-nilly, because there's a fear that they are addictive. And so what Purdue Pharma sets out to do, and this is at a point where the Sacklers totally dominate the board, and a number of the family members are intimately acquainted with the decisions that are getting made about how the drug will be marketed, is to launch a marketing blitz to persuade the American medical establishment that this is all hysteria, that actually these drugs are severely underprescribed, and that OxyContin itself is not addictive. So they send out an army of sales reps. They have all of this medical literature, which in retrospect looks pretty bogus, in which they argue that what they said again and again and again was a mantra. It's addictive less than 1% of the time. It's addictive less than 1% of the time. They didn't know this. They hadn't done studies to establish this. This was kind of conjecture. It was wishful thinking. And they fanned out across the country. They set up a speakers bureau in which they would pay some doctors to make the case to other doctors. And so they would say to you, listen, we're going to have an educational seminar at a golf course in Scottsdale, all expenses paid, come down, we're paying these doctors to tell you about opioids and how you should be prescribing them more. Thousands of doctors were involved in the speakers program. I'm sure there are physicians in the room tonight. I've had many conversations with doctors in my life who will say to me, oh, I know that the pharma companies spend all that money and they do all that, but you could never change the way I would prescribe by buying me a steak dinner. Again, you kind of go back to that notion of the unimpeachability of physicians. So Purdue Pharma, during the boom years, was spending $9 million a year just to buy food for doctors. And I can tell you, because I've seen the paperwork, that they were looking very closely on the very specific return on investment in terms of the number of prescriptions for their drug, broken down literally to, we found that the weekend events are much more successful than the weeknight ones in terms of how they change prescribing behavior. So they unleash this drug on the country, and it's fantastically successful. They succeed, primarily by targeting not pain care specialists, but general practitioners who are actually pretty naive often and haven't had much education in how to prescribe these drugs. And most of the education that a whole generation of doctors get comes care of Purdue Pharma and then subsequently other pharmaceutical companies. Profits are huge. They double again. Within a few years, this is a $1 billion drug. It eclipses Viagra, which was kind of the blockbuster drug of the day. It's a great time for the Sacklers. They're giving money away left and right to museums, to elite universities across this country and around the world. And people start dying. People start dying. There was this conjecture that the drug wouldn't be abused, and almost immediately it turns out that it is abused, that people find that they either will use it as a party drug You've probably heard the expression hillbilly heroin, which was thrown around at the time. Or they will often take it exactly as the doctor ordered and find that there's a kind of physiological undertow that they get caught up in. They need to dose more often. The pain keeps coming back. There's various ways that they can, they start taking more pills than they're supposed to. They start crushing the pills. Some people start snorting the pills, dissolving them and shooting them. And so soon you have a runaway problem. I should pause here and say, some of you may be wondering, well, where was the FDA in all this? And if the Sacklers were here with us tonight, they would say, we're very different from the Sinaloa cartel because all we ever did was sell an FDA-approved drug. So, funny story about that. In Arthur Sackler's history, there's a sort of interesting lineage here in which, going back to the 1950s, Pfizer, which was a client of Arthur's, bribed the head of antibiotics at the FDA in what at the time was a huge scandal. I think these days it rarely works that way, but there are subtler forms of regulatory capture that play into this story. So in the case of OxyContin, there was a fellow named Curtis Wright, who was the main official at the FDA, who was in charge of approving the drug, not just for sale to American consumers, but also for approving these marketing claims, which in retrospect seem so questionable. So Curtis Wright signs off on the drug in record time. And not long afterwards starts thinking that he might be ready to leave government, perhaps get a job in the private sector. And a little over a year after he leaves the FDA, he ends up working at Purdue Pharma for 3 times his government salary. And I should say, there's nothing illegal about that. And there are no safeguards in place even today to prevent that sort of thing. And in fairness, it's hard to create safeguards to prevent that. Do you have a cooling off period? How long is it? Is 3 years too short? If it's too long, are you going to be able to get good people? So I sympathize, but I think most people looking at that and knowing that the man who approved OxyContin went on to work for Purdue Pharma would find that pretty troubling. So you get this moment where the company has been sort of hoping that these problems won't catch up with them, and essentially denying that they even know anything about it. Remarkably, in retrospect, you have multiple senior officials from Purdue and at least one of the Sacklers who subsequently said under oath, oh, we never really knew there was any sort of a problem until early in, I think it was early in 2000. It might have been early 2001. It was early in 2000, 4 years after the drug was introduced. Now, if you look at the records, it's pretty clear that the company was well aware that there were problems long before that, in part because they had an early warning system, which was this army of sales representatives who were out across the country talking with doctors and pharmacists and nurses and hearing about their experiences with the drug. So it becomes clear that people are dying, that kids are dying. And when they finally have to answer for this, the company and the Sacklers make a second really amazing pivot, which is they say, oh, okay, all right, well, there are problems with the drug, yes. But the problem isn't really the drug. The problem is the people using it. It's the people abusing it. It's the weak moral character of these people. And Richard Sackler, who's the son of Raymond Sackler, the younger of the brothers, who's now the kind of presiding force at the company, he says in emails, we need to hammer the abusers. He says, these are not victims, they are victimizers. And so they make this really deft step, which is to say, yes, there's a problem, but it's a law enforcement problem. And I think that this actually kind of taps into a fairly deep-seated set of biases we have in this country, a series of libertarian principles, a notion that you can take something that's dangerous and make billions of dollars by sending it out into the stream of commerce, and if terrible things happen downstream, as long as there's one person exercising agency between you and whatever the terrible thing happens is, then you're pretty much off the hook. I mean, this is guns don't kill people. People kill people. And I think it also plays into the way in which we think about addiction, and we talk about addiction in this country, which is often a question of, it's a question of will and morals, and not the notion that you could find yourself in the grip of of a drug that is a juggernaut and very, very difficult for people to reckon with. You get a series of lawsuits, as you would imagine, against the company that developed during these years, and the company taps the best lawyers they can find and has a huge budget. They're often initially getting the cases dismissed. Then what they'll do is they'll settle, almost always with a provision that the record be sealed and the evidence that has come out be sealed. Judges have been very, very obliging in sealing the record of what happened. And this kind of goes on for years. When the press tries to write about Purdue and the Sacklers, they shut the press down. I tell a story in the book about Barry Meyer, a New York Times reporter, who was really the first person in a big national outlet to cover this story. Purdue Pharma sent a squadron of lawyers to the New York Times at a moment of vulnerability for the New York Times. This was just after the Jason Blair scandal. So the New York Times was very, I think, kind of ripe for manipulation. And they took Barry Meyer off the story at the request of Purdue. When Congress holds hearings, Purdue executives come and lie to them. When law enforcement figures in various states, U.S. attorneys, others, start looking into the company offers jobs to these law enforcement people and brings them in. They hired Rudy Giuliani. It was his first job coming out of being mayor of New York. He opened up his consultancy, and his first client was Purdue Pharma. Again, it's a law enforcement issue. Trust Giuliani. They hired Mary Jo White, who is a great hero to many lawyers, a woman now at Debevoise and Plimpton, but obviously had been the U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, would go on to be the head of the SEC under Obama. A really remarkable figure, and I think somebody who is venerated by many lawyers, many of her peers and many young lawyers, but also somebody who at this point has worked for over a decade for Purdue as a hatchet woman for this company at a period of time when lots and lots and lots of people were dying, and the company knew that people were dying. One of the most dramatic examples of this is an investigation that you end up getting by a team of assistant U.S. attorneys in Virginia who start looking into Purdue and indeed looking into the Sacklers. They spend years subpoenaing documents, doing grand jury interviews, and they develop this case. And the case is a misbranding case, felony misbranding case against 3 senior executives at the company, the layer of management that's just beneath the Sacklers. And what they want to do is bring felony charges against these people. And they put together this amazing document, a prosecution memo, in which they draw on 5 years of research to say, these are the charges we want to bring against these guys. Now, I've interviewed some of the people who are involved in this process, and the plan was they wanted to flip these guys to go after the Sacklers, because the perception was that the Sacklers were running the company and benefiting from it the most. And the way they would do this was with felony charges, the danger of jail time. These are, if you talk to anybody who's been a prosecutor, white-collar criminals are pretty soft targets when it comes to this sort of thing. If you can actually charge them with felonies and they're looking at the prospect of jail, you can often get them to cooperate. And so they had these felony charges, they had their prosecution memo. It was actually approved by the fraud section at Maine Justice. And then there was an intervention by lawyers for the company, among them Mary Jo White and Rudy Giuliani. This is during the George W. Bush administration. And a decision was made by the political leadership at Justice to abandon the felony charges and just do misdemeanor charges. I'll tell you how badly this decision stinks. I interviewed both the assistant attorney general of the criminal, who ran the criminal division at the time, and the deputy attorney general, one of whom made this decision, and they both basically pointed at the other one. Like, no, this is an orphan decision. Nobody will tell me what happened behind closed doors all these years later. But what that meant was that Purdue Pharma, the company, could pay a $600 million fine. They actually did this sort of shell game thing where it was like they had Purdue, the older Purdue pay the fine and effectively go out of business. The 3 executives got community service. Nobody rolled on the Sacklers. And it was business as usual at Purdue. In fact, they became more profitable after that. That was 2007. Their biggest year in terms of profitability was 2010, when they made $3 billion in a year. Just for perspective, OxyContin since 1996 has generated some $35 billion in revenue. Arlen Specter, the late senator from this state, was on the Judiciary Committee and was at a hearing not long after this deal was made. And he sort of asked a rhetorical question. He said, what happens when you have a corporate defendant that's making billions of dollars a year and you fine them $600 million for the misconduct, but no executives go to prison? Is that a deterrent? Is that going to change the way they behave? Or is that just a very expensive speeding ticket? And he died before he could find out, but it was very much the latter. It was a speeding ticket. I've interviewed many, many people who worked at the company during this time, and the official story was that the company was reformed and there were a few bad apples and what have you, but in fact they just went right back into the business of very aggressively marketing OxyContin in large doses for long periods of time. I came into this story in 2016. And initially wrote a piece in the New Yorker about the Sacklers, which they weren't thrilled about. And I initially didn't think that I could do a book because they were so secretive and it was a privately held company. But eventually more documents came out and more people started contacting me, and I decided I would do a book. And I should be clear, nobody in the family cooperated with this. They were very unenthusiastic about the prospect. I ended up drawing on tens of thousands of pages of documents and interviewing hundreds of people. And because so much of their communications would eventually come out in litigation, and because I was leaked things, even though I didn't have access, I was able to tell the story largely in their own words. But they hired a lawyer, a very unpleasant guy named Tom Clare, who specializes in killing stories before they're published. And he started writing me letters. I hadn't even started writing the book, actually. It was announced that I was writing the book when I got the first letter, which was 16 single-spaced pages. We developed this intense epistolary relationship over the next couple of years. You know, it's funny. In a way, this was part of the story I wanted to tell, was that the headwinds are just incredibly strong when you try and write about these people. And I think one of the questions that people have when they read my book and they look at this story is, how do they get away with it for so long? How do they get away with it for so long? That guilty plea was in 2007. And you know, the opioid crisis would end up blossoming to a point where more than 500,000 Americans have died now. 100,000 Americans died last year. How did they get away with it for so long? And the answer, I would submit to you, is in no small part lawyers. And people like this guy, Tom Clare, people like Rudy Giuliani, people like Mary Jo White. Even as a law student, I think I felt a little bit of discomfort at the notion of zealous advocacy. I mean, I think it's an appealing idea, and I think that in principle, it's a sound idea. But I guess I would say mostly to the students who are here, when you think about the kind of life you want to have, and I say this in part because I've seen my own classmates, right? It becomes very, very easy. There's another kind of undertow, right? Which is that you go in, you work at a firm, you're doing white-collar criminal defense, there's a big client, you get to know these people, and actually, you know, they maybe have a compelling story to tell. They're kind of like you, they have an elite background, you know, they went to great schools, they give generously to art museums, and you're doing the work for them year in and year out. And I really do think that I think there's a deep moral compromise, I do. And the worst of it is that I think it's a moral compromise by people who, frankly, because of their elite educations and because they're the kinds of smart, ambitious people who end up at law schools like this or law schools like I went to, they're people who totally have other options. This is not something they need to do. There's a woman I read about in the book named Joanna Lidgate, who was the Deputy Attorney General in Massachusetts, and she had this great line that I always think about. She said that she always thinks of something that a professor of hers told her in law school, which is that everybody is entitled to a lawyer, but that doesn't mean it has to be you. And I think in some ways this is a story about the awesome capability of private money to subvert public institutions, to subvert the various gatekeepers that are supposed to protect us, to subvert government, to subvert the press. And the tool for doing that is very, very often lawyers who should really know better. Happy to have you push back in the Q&A, but that would be my general take. A couple of final points here. Things start to change in 2018. And the two big changes are that Maura Healey, the Attorney General in Massachusetts, does something that no other Attorney General has done up to that point. So at that point, pretty much every state in the country is suing Purdue Pharma for its role in the opioid crisis. And there's all these private lawsuits. There are thousands of lawsuits at this point. Maura Healey names members of the Sackler family and actually starts targeting them and saying, hey, listen, I mean, Richard Sackler was an executive at the company. There were other Sacklers who were executives at the company. The board was totally dominated by the family. Why should we not see about their responsibility? They fought this very hard. They sent Mary Jo White to Boston to try and stop it in its tracks. But Maura Healey persisted and ended up releasing this incredibly damning complaint in which she quoted a huge amount of internal documents, which really did not look good for the Sacklers. The other big, and I should say roughly half the states followed her lead after that and named the Sacklers in their own cases as well. The other big development involves a woman named Nan Goldin. This is in part a story about the art world, and Nan Goldin's an artist. She's a photographer, one of the great living American photographers. And she developed an addiction to OxyContin. And in 2017, she was in recovery and at a rehabilitation center in Massachusetts. And she picked up The New Yorker and read the article that I'd written about the Sacklers. And we had this very funny exchange, which is that I got a note that somebody from the studio of Nan Goldin wanted to meet, and we had tea, and she told me, I'm going to start a movement to get their name taken off of all these museums. And I will admit to you, Nan's a bit older than me. And I thought, well, that's very retro. You know, I sort of thought, like, you start a movement? What does this even look like, you know, in this day and age? I mean, this is pre-pandemic, but the idea of a form of activism that didn't involve, you know, tweeting seemed novel. And sure enough, she did it. She started staging a series of protests at the Met, at the Guggenheim, at the Louvre in Paris, at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And the name started to come down, first at Tufts, at the Louvre, you know, more recently at NYU, just last week at the British Museum. It came down at the Met. And so you've seen this change. In 2020, going back to Arlen Specter's rhetorical question, Purdue Pharma pled guilty to new criminal charges, new federal charges, for conduct that was, the specific charges were different, but it was the same flavor of activity that they had pled guilty to back in 2007. So this is a recidivist corporation. This time around, there weren't even any misdemeanor charges for any executives. In fact, no executives were named, which I think kind of touches on another problem that we have when we deal with these issues, which is that you allow the corporation to take the hit. And I don't know how you could possibly create a deterrent for executives if they know that the corporation will pay the fine and they'll be just fine. I say in the book, it's as if the company was a driverless car, right? It's like, who committed these crimes? Who made the decision? Nowhere is an executive named. But the end game, as those of you who followed this in the news will know, perplexingly, has been in bankruptcy court. In a bankruptcy court in White Plains, New York, where Purdue ended up declaring bankruptcy a couple of years ago, in front of a judge that the company had handpicked, because until quite recently you could do that in New York. And you may be wondering, well, $35 billion in revenue, how is it that they're declaring bankruptcy? And the answer is that for about a decade leading up to that, the Sacklers had been quietly siphoning money out of the company. They had taken more than $10 billion out of the company and put it in their own trusts and accounts, many of them overseas, and then declared bankruptcy because there were all these lawsuits against the company. And they found this judge, this rather obliging judge, who subscribed to the notion of what are called non-consensual third-party releases in a bankruptcy case. So the Sacklers didn't declare bankruptcy. What they did was they said, we will pay a sum of money to make all this go away, but what we would like from you, Judge, is to be immunized from any future civil litigation. All these cases go, we are out of it permanently. And this particular judge, this varies from circuit to circuit and judge to judge, but this particular judge believed that that was a power that he as a bankruptcy judge should have, that he could shut down all of the states that were suing the family and protect this family that actually hadn't declared bankruptcy before him. And so there's been a lot of back and forth in the negotiations. The number, the most recent number is $6 billion that the Sacklers will pay, which is a large number, but I would encourage you to remember that they have an $11 billion fortune, and it's going to be paid out very slowly. Initially, it was over 9 years. Now, parts of it, they're going to have 18 years. And I would encourage you to think about Arthur Sackler and that gift to the Met, and the annual return that you can get on an $11 billion fortune. If you pay it out slowly enough, $6 billion is, well, obviously a huge number, probably more manageable than it might look at a glance. So this, I'm afraid, in the end, is a story in which the bad guys get away with it. And I hope I've touched on some of the structural and regulatory reasons for why it is that the super elite in this country enjoy the kind of impunity that they do. The one thing I'll leave you with, which I hope is a small consolation, is that I keep thinking, as you see the name coming off the walls, about that thing that Isaac Sackler told his sons during the Great Depression. If you lose a fortune, you can always make another fortune. It's just money. But if you lose your good name, you can never get it back. And I think that there is an infamy associated with the Sacklers now that is going to be hard to get rid of. There is a sense that they play a part. They play, a significant part in having ignited this terrible crisis that has killed so many people. So I do think that in the end, they've kept much of the fortune, but they've lost their good name, and I don't think they're ever going to get it back. Thank you so much again for having me. You can do any questions.
Thank you, Patrick. Fascinating, truly fascinating. And as I was about to read the passcode, so you can all see it, those in our virtual audience as well as anybody here right now, I also invite Professor Alison Hoffman to join Patrick Radden Keefe on stage. The second CLE word, of course, if you can't see it, is doctor. I repeat that again. The second CLE word is doctor. Well, we're delighted to have the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law Professor Alison Hoffman to serve as our interlocutor this evening. Professor Hoffman is a leading expert on healthcare law and policy. Her research and scholarship examines some of the most important legal and social issues of our time, including healthcare, health insurance regulation and policy design, the Affordable Care Act, and Medicare. Thank you both.
Patrick, that was excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I was thinking as I was listening to you talk that when we were in law school and we were, which is now 20 years ago, almost? Yeah, 20 years ago. Sorry to age you in front of the audience.
Day before yesterday.
That we knew that there were really amazingly thoughtful, brilliant, devoted people around us, and you didn't necessarily know the ways in which your classmates would do just incredible things. But reading your work since many years, and then reading this book, it's just an insight into your devotion to do good things with your talents and also your brilliance as a writer. So, oh yes, and I can move this closer too. So it's an honor to have you here. It's really nice to be able to connect now in a professional and reconnect in a personal capacity. So I would love to ask you. You touched on a lot of the themes I was thinking about as I was reading the book, and I would love to ask you a little bit more about a few of them. And then I see we have questions from the audience as well. So I do want to push a little bit on the role of lawyers, and in particular, you start the book with the lawyers, right? And you start the book with Mary Jo White, and I went and I pulled up her Debevoise bio, and it reads, reading from her bio, quote, "She's described by one peer as the single best white-collar lawyer I've worked with, bar none. The guide also described her as a doyen of the white-collar bar and a towering figure in the litigation market. Sources note she's a force of nature who stands out above the rest of the crowd, while fellow practitioners say she's incredibly smart and she works very hard." And with her background and reading this bio, she could represent anyone, right? Like if she wants to cash out, she wants to make lots of money, she could do that representing lots of different people. So why do you think for her, and you loop back to her at the end as well, right? Why the Sacklers? Why does she do this?
Well, I mean, I can only speculate. She doesn't give a lot of interviews. I've asked myself the same thing, and I think that there's probably a sense. Mary Jo White once described herself as being in the big mess business. That she's kind of the, she's like Harvey Keitel in Pulp Fiction. She's the cleaner. She comes in when it's all a mess and takes care of stuff. And I think that that's probably a point of pride for a certain kind of lawyer with their peers and when they look in the mirror, that there's a competence associated with being the person who comes in and does the impossible thing. It's a different professional tribe, but I think the same is true with kind of crisis communications type people. It's a badge of honor to say that you worked for Jeffrey Epstein or whoever it is, because there's this sense, we look at him and say, oh, what a morally irredeemable person, how can you take his money? But somebody else who's, I think, particularly kind of caught up in that adversarial mindset might look at it and say, well, that's where the action is you want to take the hard case. I think my frustration with somebody like Mary Jo White, and I should say, obviously, she's totally entitled to do what she wants to do. I think, in my work on cartels, I spent a lot of time on the border talking to these amazing cartel lawyers. It's a really particular species, and they are great fun and totally morally scary. But they have this kind of devil-may-care, they sort of own the fact that they're right on the line in terms of, the good guys and the bad guys. And I think what's strange to me with somebody like Mary Jo White is that she's a person who's quite revered. And the thing that I don't, so it's, of course she's totally entitled to do what she does, but this is a company now that's pled guilty twice to these crimes, and in fact, they didn't learn after the first time. So there's a moment in my book where I talk about, Richard Sackler was asked in a deposition that in the 2007 case, there's an agreed statement of facts where the company is going to plead guilty, and so they have this very carefully negotiated document that they negotiate with the Department of Justice where they say, okay, here are the bad things we did do that we'll acknowledge. And Richard Sackler, after this, is asked in a deposition, were there things that you found particularly troublesome when you read the agreed statement of facts? And he says, well, I didn't read it. And I think this is the thing I find dismaying, is I kind of understand representing them the first time and doing the move where you go to DOJ and you get the felony charges thrown out, and good for you, and I'm sure it was a great payday. What I don't understand is when it turns out your client is a recidivist, and it becomes documented that lots and lots of people are dying, and the company ends up pleading guilty to much the same stuff again. And the guy who was sort of the driving force in the family says he didn't even bother to read the statements of fact. There, I feel as though it's, if I were Mary Jo White, I think I would be saying, help me help you, meet me halfway here. And so I don't know. I mean, my sense is it's probably just a sense that that's the big game, and that's the way you distinguish yourself. But But morally, I don't find that to be a particularly persuasive rationale.
It's interesting. I was reading about the recent $6 billion settlement agreement. And one of the pieces that I thought was most striking was that as part of that, there was the opportunity for people who had been harmed to be able to say words to both the Raymond and Mortimer families. I don't know if you read this. It talked about.
I listened to it live.
Did you listen to it live? Yeah. And the thing that I noted was that Richard had his camera turned off during it. And I wasn't surprised, actually, after reading your book. And does that fit into you with just the general story of his unwillingness to engage with kind of what was going on with the litigation as well?
Yeah, I mean, I should say, just because it's something I didn't touch on, and to be perfectly clear, the Sacklers, there are three different wings of the family. Some of the fun in the book is that they don't always get along. There's a lot of family drama. But one thing they all agree on is that they're just terribly misunderstood, and that they haven't done anything wrong, and then in fact they're kind of the victims here. And I sort of came to conclude at a certain point that it's one of the downsides they don't tell you about of being a billionaire, is that you're surrounded by people whose income depends on their perception that they're kind of they're telling you what you want to hear, they're reaffirming all your biases, and so you can slowly, by degrees, become deeply delusional because you have this coterie of people around you saying, yes, you're absolutely right, you're just misunderstood. And the kind of grotesque endpoint of that is that you have this family now, which is getting hauled before Congress, but it was a real point of pride for them that they never apologized. Even when they agreed to pay $6 billion, they said, but we're not apologizing or acknowledging that we've done anything wrong. And so Richard, I think, is an old man who was pretty emotionally chilly to begin with, and has an extraordinary intellectual arrogance. And to this day, he basically believes that OxyContin's a perfectly good drug and you would never get addicted to it if you took it as the doctor ordered. And I should say, it's documented that hundreds of thousands of people have gotten addicted to it when they used it as the doctor ordered. But his position is that it never happens. And so it wasn't totally surprising to me that in this very dramatic moment where victims got to talk about, in most cases it was mothers talking about losing children. And they had an opportunity to address some of the Sacklers, only 3 of them, over Zoom. And 2 of them were on Zoom and kind of expressionless the whole time. And Richard said he would call in on the phone, but he wasn't going to let them see his face.
Interesting. So you were just touching on also the role of physicians, and there's actually a lot of questions in this packet. I think we have some doctors in the audience who wanted to know more about your thoughts on the obligation of and the responsibility of the physicians involved. And you talked about the money, the $9 million to buy food, which is still perfectly legal and can still happen. I'm sure it still does happen, right? And although there's more transparency than there used to be, but still. And one of the things that struck me was the role of doctors in advocating for the rollout of OxyContin. From the beginning, you talk about Russell Portnoy, who was chairman of the Department of Pain and Palliative Medicine at Beth Israel. And when I first got to his name in the book, I Googled him, and he's still practicing doctor, and he actually turned witness, right, during the course of the litigation. What do you think about both kind of looking backwards, the role of doctors in kind of propagating what happened, and then also kind of going forward. I think you talked maybe in the afterword about how there still needs to be a continued conversation about the right balance with pain control and an appropriate use of opioid medicines. What do you think about the role, or how does this book and how does the writing of this book make you think about the roles and obligations of doctors going forward as well?
Oh, it's such a great question. I mean, I think there's kind of a continuum, right? There are a bunch of doctors I read about in this book who are just criminals, who are crooks, who ran pill mills and basically were in this for money and knew what they were doing, and many of them ended up in prison. So that's one extreme. And then on the other extreme, you have people like Russell Portnoy, these doctors who I think, I wouldn't call them corrupt. I think that they had an earnest belief that opioids were being underprescribed, and they became kind of evangelical about that. And it wasn't even that you had a conflict of interest so much as you had a sort of confluence of interest, where just at the point where doctors like Kathy Foley and Russell Portnoy were making this case, along came the opioid industry and said, we like what you're saying, can we help amplify? And the doctors were very happy to take the support. But again, because they believed that the opioid companies were doing the Lord's work. And I think there was a kind of groupthink that happened. In between, you have lots and lots and lots of physicians who, I mean, it was explained to me by one doctor I was talking to who basically said, listen, I was a dupe. I was duped, but I was a busy doctor. I got into this work because I want to relieve the suffering of my patients. Somebody comes to me and they say, I have a solution and there's virtually no downsides. Basically, he said, I was an easy mark because in a way they appealed to my idealism. And so I think there's that as well. So you have all these different types of people. And then, I mean, I would go back to something I said earlier about how there's a perception of the unimpeachability of physicians. Arthur Sackler used to say, hilariously, he would say, oh, a physician could never be influenced by something like advertising. The only thing in a physician's mind is the proper dictates of appropriate care for the patient. So, yes, I run a medical advertising company, but it's really education that I'm doing. And there was this kind of, this aura around the profession, which I think probably many of you, whether you're doctors or not, would relate to, right? That you go and see a doctor and the doctor tells you what to do, and unless you're my wife, you won't second guess them and immediately go on Google and come up with alternative hypotheses. There's a tendency to sort of to treat doctors like priests or rabbis, and I think that I'm from Boston, and I think about the Catholic Church in Boston and the scandal of sex abuse in the Catholic Church, and I tend to think that if you have any business or any industry or any vocation in which there's a sense that there's a kind of a type of professional that is unimpeachable, there's huge moral hazard there. And I feel as though the Sacklers and Purdue really exploited that. So to the second part of your question, we're now seeing the pendulum swing back in the other direction. So having overprescribed like crazy for decades, American physicians, I think, have realized that opioids can be quite dangerous. I should say, I don't think these drugs should be pulled from the shelves. I think they have really important therapeutic uses. I think that they've been overprescribed. I think they're prescribed too quickly. I think people are kept on them for too long. But the issue for me really is marketing and sort of knowing what it is that you're prescribing, and the patient knowing what it is that you're getting. There is a real cause of alarm among people particularly people who suffer with chronic pain, that the pendulum is swinging back too far the other way, and doctors are now trying to get people to aggressively taper or cutting them off, which of course can just lead people to the black market again. Fundamentally, I think the problem is that it's been 30 years since this whole process started, and there was a big education financed by industry in how to get people on these drugs, and not a lot of care or attention given to how do you get people off? Like, how long should people be on them, and what do you do? I've interviewed surgeons who, write a script and then you leave and they expect to never see you again, and then you go back 3 or 4 weeks later and you say, "Doc, I'm having trouble with this drug that you put me on," and very, very often the response by the surgeon has been to say, whoa, I'm not an addiction specialist, right? And so you often end up with the patient, I think, kind of marooned by that. And so I think there should be, broadly speaking, more medical education, both on how and when you get people on these drugs, but also on how and when you get them off.
Is there a role you talked about the failure of regulation. Is there a role for regulation in that space as well? So it struck me when you were talking about, there's a piece I would actually love to read that when I came to this line in the book, I was like, yeah, this is what I was thinking as I'm reading all the regulatory pieces. So you wrote, the opioid crisis is, among other things, a parable about the awesome capability of private industry to subvert public institutions. Just as the FDA was compromised and Congress was neutralized or outright co-opted with generous donations, and some federal prosecutors were undermined with a back-channel appeal in Washington, while others were mollified with the promise of a corporate job, just as state legislators and the CDC were hindered and sabotaged when they tried to curb opioid prescribing, the DEA was not immune to these pressures and proceeded to soften its position under a steady barrage of industry encouragement. And I got to this point, and I'm a believer in regulation. I teach health law. I believe in the bureaucracy and the regulatory system. But as I kept reading one failure after another, I mean, the description of the Curtis Wright episode with the FDA and what Purdue had written was a marketing pamphlet that he resisted at first and then, eventually approved. And, even going back to Arthur Sackler and the, Valium, it wasn't sold as a controlled substance. MS Contin, they didn't even apply for regulatory approval, right? And now the DEA as well. And I know the CDC, when it was putting out new guidelines, then it delayed it. And so, do you think that there's a space for, well, first of all, you in your remarks, you seem to think that that there is kind of a less kind of dramatic failure in the regulatory space now perhaps than there was then. I think you said there's more subtler forms of influence, maybe less, kind of overt forms of influence. Do you think the regulation in these spaces is becoming better? And do you think that there's more space for regulators to help think about opioids kind of going forward than what they have done?
I mean, I'm not particularly encouraged, to be honest with you. In part because I just think that at every level, I think this was what was so depressing for me. I promise it's not a depressing book. But along the way, part of what was so frustrating was to see that we have all of these different organs of government and civil society that were positioned to intervene in one way or another. But if you have a drug that generates $35 billion in revenue, that money just kind of trickles out, and you have all of these kind of fixers and enablers who find ways to translate that into influence. And I guess when I said it's more subtle, what I meant is, it used to be a suitcase full of money. You would just bribe somebody, and now it's never that. And it's generally speaking not illegal. I mean, with the FDA, this is another sort of strange little anthropological thing that as a reporter, I often come up against. But this was the FDA in the 1990s. I mean, I interviewed David Kessler, who was running the FDA then, and he told me, He said that the destigmatization of opioids that OxyContin ushered in was one of the great mistakes of modern medicine. He also said in the same breath, but personally I had nothing to do with the approval of OxyContin in 1996. And the thing that's strange to me is it was a whole different FDA. It was mostly different people, and yet today there is a kind of almost intramural sense of allegiance that the people who are the current leaders and sort of rank and file people at the FDA feel. It's a strange aspect of government bureaucracy, right, in terms of learning from your mistakes, that there is this sense of allegiance. So to give you an example, Curtis Wright. I FOIA'd the FDA. And they blew me off, which I knew they would. And so I sued the FDA in federal court and got a judge to order them to to do this big production schedule where they were turning over thousands of pages of documents to me. And what I really wanted more than anything was Curtis Wright's emails. Because I was wondering, when did he and Purdue start talking about this? Was he still at the FDA? Was he still working on the drug? And they came back, when ordered by a judge, they came back, it's not even the dog ate my homework. They came back, and it's I ate my homework. They came back and said, we have no records relating to Curtis Wright. They have all either been lost or destroyed. And I think the thing that's hard is, I know for a fact that those prosecutors in Virginia subpoenaed stuff that Curtis Wright was a target of that investigation. The FDA was absolutely on notice in 2004, 5, 6 that this guy who had been there until recently was an issue, right? So it's not a situation in which at a certain point they have just a data retention policy and they just get rid of stuff. To me, that seems like an agency that's not particularly eager to learn from its own past mistakes. So it's been a hard one with this book. The book came out almost exactly a year ago, and it's been an uncomfortable time for me in the sense that I think everybody should get vaccinated, and I think that most of us can sort of manage a healthy skepticism where you're not blindly credulous when it comes to the motivations of big pharma and the sufficiency of FDA regulation, but at the same time you don't go to the opposite extreme and you're completely cynical. And it's been hard for me to occasionally see the book held up as like, I mean, occasionally people will tag me on Twitter and say, I'm not getting vaccinated because I read this book. I'm like, no, not what I meant at all. But I think, I don't know that the signs are encouraging.
When you think about, you've a couple of times said, the influence of money over the process, and I was wondering as I was reading, there's a lot of money, but it's also the Sacklers, who just seem to be a cult of personality. It seemed like they could move things that other people, even with money, might not be able to. Do you think it was both, or was it truly just the amount of money that has flooded into employing regulators and hiring lawyers and doctors and all of the other ways that they've used their money to kind of grow the business?
I think it's mostly money, in part because these are not particularly charismatic people. I mean, Arthur was a very charismatic person, but the later Sacklers are not. It's not that they have the kind of personal dynamism where there's a sense that they are kingmakers in one world or another. I think it's mostly money, but I think it's the very, very careful cultivation of influence. Mm-hmm. And I just think they're just third-degree black belt influence peddlers. And so it's, I guess what I'm saying is you can be Kathy Sackler, who I start the book with. Her lawyer is Mary Jo White. Kathy can be and is a pretty uncharismatic person. But her lawyer is Mary Jo White. I mean, that's all you need, right? And Mary Jo White would be the kingmaker. As long as you can afford a Mary Jo White, then I think you're going to have all kinds of people who will do your bidding.
So I want to squeeze in one last question, even though we only have a couple of minutes, because I was thinking this question as I was reading, and we also got it from an audience member here, which is, as I was reading, the personalities of the Sacklers really come through. What comes through less is the individual lives lost. There's some numbers and some, accounting of that, but the individual people. And I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, which has been one of the epicenters of the opioid epidemic, and I've lost high school classmates to overdoses, and so I'm seeing these faces as I'm reading this book. And it struck me that you end the book with this person you called Jeff, who was addicted, his wife was addicted, their child was born dependent. He also happened to work on the grounds of Mortimer and Jacqueline. And they both recovered, though. I was ready for one of them to have, as I'm reading along, to not have made it. But they both recovered. And so you end with the story of this guy, Jeff, who you call Jeff, a survivor story. Why? Why that choice to end with, with his particular story and your interaction with him?
Well, I mean, there were a number of very good books about the opioid crisis that had come out before mine, and there was a kind of particular style of storytelling that you see across most of those books, which is a sort of multi-strand narrative in which you have a doctor and a lawyer and a pharmaceutical executive, and then somebody who becomes addicted, and you're kind of cutting back and forth. If any of you have watched Dope Sick on Hulu, it's very much that kind of approach. And I felt that when it came to the Sacklers, that was a storytelling style that had really benefited them, because it made it possible for them to sort of, in a way, kind of disappear into the background. So I set out to write a book very consciously about the perpetrators more than the victims. And I had a rule for myself too, which is that I didn't want to do what a lot of these books do, which is cut away to somebody in a totally different place who doesn't connect into your main story. And the challenge I gave myself, which is harder, I think, is I'm only going to tell stories of people struggling with addiction if they actually connect in some first order way, because I'll bet they're out there. And of course, once you start looking into it, you find that the legal secretary who worked outside the office of the general counsel of Purdue Pharma steps away from the offices of the Sacklers on the 9th floor of the office in Stamford, was prescribed OxyContin because her colleagues recommended it after an injury, became addicted, and when she grew addicted to OxyContin, their own drug, was fired after 20 years. So I tell her story. There are other people like that who kind of connect in. I mean, there's a story I tell, obviously, about one of the Sacklers who committed suicide, who had also struggled with addiction. In the case of that guy, Jeff, I think part of what I was trying to get at is that there is a, I talked about that pivot that the Sacklers made when they, and the company made when they said, oh, the problem is the abusers, they're these other people. I think there was this sense of kind of, it's not in our world, that we live in this pristine world where you don't see the consequences of this. And when I met this person who had been addicted to OxyContin while working on the property of the mansion of Mortimer Sackler Jr., I mean, the irony is almost too much to hold in your head. And so I wanted to end on that, in part because there's a little bit of hope there, but also because there is this sense that they can sort of seal themselves off from the downstream consequences of their own horrendous decisions, only up to a point. And the truth is that, I'm sure in this room there are people who struggle with opioids of one sort or another, who have family or friends who have, and I sort of wanted to bring that home, that the people who have felt the impact of this thing are everywhere. Sometimes they're in your own backyard.
Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Dean Ruger, thank you, everybody, Ron's family, children, all of you. Thank you so much for being with us tonight to celebrate this amazing human being, Ron Littman. I think our program was really very interesting. Thank you for all the questions. At this moment, that officially concludes. Oh, I'm sorry. I did not read the final passcode. It was pediatric. I think those of you who could see it did see it, but for anybody who needs that, it's pediatric, so include that for your CLE code. Let's see, thanks. I wanted to mention that we do have a book signing. Thank you. Patrick's very kind. I think we'll limit that to about 15 minutes, and then we'll make our way to the reception. So again, I can't thank everybody enough. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening.